Political violence was highlighted by the recent assassination on conservative commentator Charlie Kirk, adding to concerns about rising extremism and violence against public figures. Advocates for strict crackdowns argue that political violence undermines democracy, intimidates communities, and must be met with strong law enforcement and prevention measures. Critics counter that definitions of political violence can be applied unevenly, potentially criminalizing dissent or protest. They argue focus should be on root causes like polarization and mistrust. Abortion is one of the most divisive issues in the U.S., intensified after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. Wade in 2022. State laws now vary widely, with some imposing near-total bans while others safeguard access. Pro-choice advocates argue women must have autonomy over their bodies and healthcare decisions. Pro-life supporters counter that abortion ends a human life and should be restricted or banned to protect the unborn, reflecting deeply held moral and religious beliefs. Gun control remains a central U.S. debate, especially after frequent mass shootings and rising concerns over public safety. Federal laws remain limited, leaving states to set their own firearm regulations, which vary from strict to permissive. Supporters of stronger gun control argue that universal background checks, assault weapon bans, and stricter regulations would save lives. Opponents maintain that the Second Amendment guarantees the right to bear arms, and that restrictions unfairly punish law-abiding citizens while failing to stop criminals. LGBT focus on marriage equality, gender identity protections, and debates over transgender rights in sports, healthcare, and schools. Advocates argue that equal treatment under the law is a fundamental human right, and that protecting LGBT individuals reduces discrimination and improves mental health. Opponents, often citing religious or cultural beliefs, argue against certain policies like gender-affirming care for minors or changes in school curriculums, saying they conflict with parental rights, tradition, or concerns about fairness and competition. Race, a persistent issue in the U.S., often linked to policing, employment, and inequality in housing and education. Advocates for systemic reform argue that racism is deeply rooted in American institutions and requires proactive policies such as affirmative action, diversity initiatives, and police reform to correct historical injustices. Critics counter that such measures create unfair advantages, foster dependency, and worsen divisions by treating people primarily through the lens of race instead of individual merit and equal opportunity. Immigration divides Americans over border security, asylum, and citizenship. Advocates for more open policies argue that immigrants strengthen the economy, enrich culture, and uphold the nation's legacy as a land of opportunity. They emphasize compassion for refugees and protections like DACA for those brought as children. Critics counter that high immigration strains public services, drives down wages, and raises security risks. They argue for stricter border enforcement, merit-based systems, and limits on asylum to maintain order and stability. The Israel-Gaza conflict is a long-standing and volatile issue tied to territory, security, and identity. Supporters of Israel argue the nation has a right to defend itself against Hamas attacks and maintain security in the region, stressing its role as a democratic ally. Critics counter that Israel's military actions and blockade create humanitarian crises, with Palestinians facing displacement, poverty, and civilian casualties. They argue the U.S. should condition aid and push harder for a two-state solution or peace talks. Russia-Ukraine has become a major global flashpoint, with the U.S. deeply involved in aiding Ukraine. Supporters of aid argue defending Ukraine protects democracy, deters authoritarian aggression, and upholds international law against territorial conquest. They see U.S. military and financial assistance as essential. Critics counter that the conflict drains American resources, risks escalation with Russia, and neglects domestic priorities. They argue Europe should shoulder more responsibility and that diplomatic negotiations are a better long-term path than open-ended military aid. Healthcare, deeply contested due to high costs and unequal access. Advocates for universal healthcare argue that government-provided coverage ensures fairness, reduces financial burdens, and improves public health outcomes. They support systems like Medicare for All or expanded subsidies. Critics counter that government-run healthcare risks inefficiency, long wait times, and reduced innovation. They argue a market-driven system encourages competition and quality, while reforms should focus on cost transparency, portability, and targeted aid rather than sweeping overhauls. Climate change, one of the most urgent global issues, with the U.S. deeply divided over how to respond. Advocates for strong action argue rising temperatures, extreme weather, and environmental damage demand immediate investment in renewable energy, emissions reductions, and international cooperation. They see inaction as risking irreversible harm. Critics counter that aggressive climate policies hurt the economy, destroy jobs in traditional energy, and impose costly regulations. They favor gradual adaptation, innovation, and energy independence over sweeping government mandates. Free speech, a core American value, but sparks disputes over its limits in schools, workplaces, and online platforms. Advocates argue broad protections are essential for democracy, even when speech is offensive or controversial. They warn that restrictions risk authoritarian overreach. Critics counter that harmful speech, such as hate speech, misinformation, or harassment, undermines safety and equality, and that reasonable limits or platform moderation are necessary. The debate intensifies around social media companies, campus speech policies, and government regulation of expression. Wealth inequality in the U.S. has grown sharply, with vast gaps between the richest Americans and the middle or working classes. Advocates for reform argue higher taxes on the wealthy, stronger unions, and expanded social programs are needed to create fairness and opportunity. They see concentrated wealth as harmful to society and democracy. Critics counter that inequality reflects merit and innovation, claiming redistribution discourages hard work and growth. They argue policies should focus on opportunity, not forced economic leveling. Minimum wage debate centers on whether federal and state rates should rise to match living costs. Advocates for higher wages argue workers deserve pay that meets basic needs, reduces poverty, and lessens reliance on public assistance. They believe raising wages also boosts consumer spending. Critics counter that increasing the minimum wage risks job losses, higher prices, and reduced opportunities for young or low-skill workers. They argue businesses, especially small ones, cannot sustain large mandated increases without economic harm. Housing affordability has become a crisis in many U.S. cities, with rising rents and home prices outpacing wages. Advocates for stronger intervention argue for expanded public housing, rent control, and zoning reforms to increase affordable supply. They believe housing is a basic human right that should be guaranteed. Critics counter that such policies distort markets, discourage development, and reduce property values. They argue solutions should focus on deregulation, private investment, and economic growth to naturally expand housing opportunities. Student loan debt exceeds $1 trillion, making it a major generational issue. Advocates for cancellation or relief argue debt burdens trap graduates, delay homeownership, and widen inequality, especially among low-income families. They support forgiveness programs and free or reduced tuition. Critics counter that loan contracts are personal responsibilities, and forgiveness is unfair to those who repaid. They also argue that mass cancellation shifts costs to taxpayers and fails to address rising tuition or systemic education costs. Education is highly contested, focusing on curriculum, funding, and parental control. Supporters of progressive approaches argue schools should include diverse perspectives, critical thinking, and lessons on race, gender, and identity to prepare students for modern society. And they also support increased public funding and equitable access. Critics counter that such content risks political indoctrination, undermines parental rights, and distracts from core academics. Many also advocate for school choice, charter schools, and reduce federal involvement in education.